Let's talk about one trend with Games Workshop that's been going on over the past few years in editions, to try and force box sets and armies to be as separate from each other as they can, even when they maybe pass up some easy wins to do so. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today I wanted to talk about one trend with Warhammer releases, which might be a little bit of an unfocused idea, but just a general sense that where possible Games Workshop seems to enjoy avoiding cross-compatibility, so basically using any one miniature for a different purpose in a different game or different unit, and seemingly trading a bit of multiple appeal of model kits for trying to keep their ranges as separate as possible from each other. This trend does feel like maybe it's a bit of a theme through a bunch of their more recent releases, both with the general model phase-outs that have been happening in 10th edition, but also occasionally new miniatures that get added to the range. I just feel like in recent times there's plenty of examples of things that could easily have interchangeable rules and be able to be played in a bunch of different factions or different systems, but have either been phased out and sent to Warhammer Legends for less good support than they would have otherwise, or just don't really work anymore. It does feel a bit weird for some of these, given that, at least on paper, if you've got one miniature design, and that same miniature design is usable for multiple different armies, then you're probably going to have more people buying it, and some of them maybe feel like a bit of a missed opportunity for Games Workshop, particularly things that people might like to see Warhammer 40k rules for but never got them. Just for a few examples, could be things like Chaos Demons and the way they're fielded in 40k and Warhammer Age of Sigmar, Space Marines and Heresy being ever more different from their Primaris counterparts in the current setting, different squads and characters often having a bit more to differentiate them in terms of very different war gear, so you can't field exactly the same miniature in different squads quite as much as you could, and at least a few unit choices not being able to be translated over to other newer armies. I thought for this one we could go through a few examples of those, talk about a few reasons why it might happen, and a few possibilities for things that are currently part of the 40k range that feel on shakier ground. I think perhaps one of the biggest and most obvious of these happened when the Horus Heresy units got locked out of competitive Warhammer 40k. At the start of 10th edition there was a fairly enormous cull here. Space Marines and Chaos Space Marines in particular had a whole ton of their things removed from their extended lineup and sent to the realm of Legends, still playable in games and in match play games, though how much they tend to be played with and generally accepted by the community does seem to vary a bit from place to place, and just in general I think it's hard to dispute that being sent to the realm of Legends is bad news. Even if Games Workshop has supported them adequately now, getting no balance updates or things in the future will generally mean that they become more and more obsolete and not really working with the current rule set. Plus whenever an edition comes out, there's just more chance they don't get their rules redone or not redone with the miniature that you have exactly. So I'd still say it's pretty bad news versus being fully supported. The Horus Heresy range going to Legends was really quite a big deal for Space Marines though, and for Chaos. Lots of their units were really quite popular ones that had been around in the Imperial Armour indexes for a while now, and had a new lease of life when they released the multi-part Leviathan and Contemptor Dreadnoughts, two really quite popular kits redone in plastic, plus things like that new Kratos tank for the Horus Heresy era, which they did make 40k rules for, and at least a fair few people picked one up for use in their armies. The way that these were treated, along with Forge World things for Space Marines, were kind of interesting. It does seem clear that Games Workshop's motivation is to keep Forge World things out of their core product. It has always been a little bit weird that sometimes the best units in an army might be made out of ridiculously expensive resin that's only got a niche audience compared with their main game. But the Horus Heresy kits often felt kind of different to this due to their recent refresh. You basically had nice quality plastic kits that Space Marine players absolutely liked and enjoyed fielding alongside their contemporary armies, only for Games Workshop to decide to lock them out to Warhammer Legends, which I'm sure would come at the expense of at least some sales of those models to 40k collectors. One of the things that got me thinking about this entire thing were the recent Heresy Era battle automata, the ones that came out alongside the Mechanicum launch recently, when there were certainly plenty of comments from 40k AdMech collectors saying that they'd very much gladly add those units to their army if they could, but these ones aren't even supported with Legends datasheets or things like that due to never having been in Warhammer 40k. I feel like for at least a good amount of the units there isn't really all that much that differentiates them aesthetically from the more modern 40k settings to the Heresy Era one. For example, this Thanatar automata just isn't really a million miles away from the Castellan robots you can get in 40k, and pretty much most of the rest would translate over quite well. To my mind, the AdMech would also be the sort of faction that tends to be fighting with relic technology of the past, dug out of the Forge world when they most need it, and there wasn't really much to stop Games Workshop just treating these like the units for the Imperial Knights or the Adeptus Custodes, where you basically have their Forge world Heresy Era vaguely themed range just essentially be another half of the army. I'm not necessarily saying that everything would need to jump the gap, but several units feel like they make sense on a case-by-case basis, certainly plenty of the automata ones, which I think will be well embraced by 40k AdMech players to have different flavours of big stompy robots to march into battle. If they ever do get round to adding bigger automata like this, I just can't help but think they wouldn't really look all that different. Otherwise, one other slightly adjacent thing to Horus Heresy units is there's further range differentiation being added by the Primaris rollout. Since 8th edition, Games Workshop has essentially been in the process of updating the entire Space Marine model line unit by unit, but just had a bit of a delay between releasing the Primaris and taking their firstborn equivalents away. Though now it looks like that's coming to fruition in 10th edition, I'm sure there'll be another wave of firstborn units on the chopping block in 11th. It means that by the time that's done and Primaris Marines are the norm for Space Marines on the tabletop, the Heresy Era range and the Primaris range will be really quite different. Maybe a few particularly iconic things such as Terminators and maybe Land Raiders will stick around. My hopes aren't particularly high for things like Rhinos and Predator tanks though. Not when they've retired loads of previous firstborn units, things like attack bikes and land speeders and the like. It seems that Games Workshop's eventual goal with them is to try and keep Heresy Era Marines and make them really quite different to regular Space Marines, and it also seems that Chaos Space Marines have been splitting away as much as possible. Besides their classic core range of things that they share with the regular Astartes, all the new releases have been things like Dinobots and Demon Engines, and all sorts of Chaos things that really differentiate them from the standard Astartes. Certainly the direction of travel feels like it's going to be to try and make the armies as different as they possibly can be, as opposed to emphasise any similarities. Otherwise, for a few other slightly quickfire examples, Demons in Age of Sigmar, where a while back you could basically field a demon army either in Age of Sigmar or in 40k fairly equally, and then it was changed so Age of Sigmar basically divided the faction amongst the different Chaos deities, so work a bit differently there, again meaning that the same range doesn't really apply quite as well both to 40k and fantasy equally, which was one of the better advantages of collecting Chaos Demons. There is still a pretty good amount of crossover though, even if not every single Chaos Demon kit is equally usable in 40k or fantasy. The Sinessa and Dexessa Twins of Slanesh don't translate over to 40k, though I guess the main reason for that might be more narrative differences to do with the whole fall of Slanesh in Age of Sigmar. Otherwise, just for a few other examples, I feel like the World Eaters and a few of the generic picks that they couldn't take were sort of interesting. Based on the precedent of Thousand Sons and Death Guard, I think most people were expecting to be able to field generic Chaos Lords for World Eaters and standard Cultists to go alongside their raised Jackals. It was interesting that neither of those happened, even if they can still act as a good amount of the standard Chaos Space Marine options like Predator tanks and the like. Another thing I noticed when these things released as well were that the Warcry Chaotic Beasts could have made quite good Chaos Furies if they decided to do some sort of dual release and allow them to be part of the Chaos Demons range. Maybe it would have been a bit more of a stretch and a bit more creative, but the miniatures themselves really were quite similar to the older Fury miniatures, and again perhaps felt like a small missed opportunity. And maybe to go off on a slight tangent as well, I feel like within each army, in general, Games Workshop's aim these days versus their days in the past are that if you have any two units or characters in the codex, to try and make them as different as they can be miniature-wise, so there's an absolute minimum of models that could be equally used in both units. Say for example, the overlap between Tactical Marines and Devastator squads, where you have some guys with bolters and some guys with heavy weapons, you could field them as either or. The only thing that makes the big difference there would be the numbers. That does feel like one difference with the new Primaris. Basically every single squad is a bit monopurpose with its own weapon loadout that doesn't really translate super well onto the rest, even if realistically quite a lot of them might be kind of similar, like say the difference between Reavers or Incursors, which both might have bolt carbines and Phobos armor, but a bit of notably distinctive features such as the Reaver's skull masks or the Incursor's scanner pack thing. I'm not saying that this is definitely the worst thing in the world though, but again does seem like another drive to make each individual model kit as separate from anything else as possible. I know the examples here might be a little bit scattergun, but just in general I feel like Games Workshop's direction of travel has generally been to try and keep each army and unit as separate from as many things as possible. Just maybe to keep things a little bit more niche so each one thing is its own product and not encroaching on anything else. It's kind of interesting to speculate why they might be doing that, I think. I suspect part of it is to try and make their different settings really quite separate narratively so that each one has got a different look and feel to it. Maybe they think that if you had things like Rhino tanks that looked kind of similar both for Loyalist, Chaos, and Heresy Era Space Marines, then it might not help the overall look and feel of the setting, even if besides decorations and things they are kind of similar. And that feels like that might have been the idea with keeping the Heresy Era Dreadnoughts in Legends as opposed to in core 40k rules. I'm sure the overall calculation must be, to some extent, whatever drives people to pick up more model kits, and perhaps they think for the overall game it might be best to keep miniatures as separate as possible. If you want to get a unit for your army, there's basically just going to be one box that represents that unit on the board. Other things aren't going to work too well from other armies, even if they might be essentially the same army in different time settings. But then I guess he's balanced it out with a lot of individual things that might have had quite good appeal if they did give them rules in different settings, like the Heresy Era Mechanicum things. I'm sure that if they as a range had released with full 40k rules and promised that they'd be in the Admech Codex next time that it came round, a lot more people would have picked them up. For things like the Warcry Chaotic Beasts and the Slanesh Twins as well, the narrative might not fit over perfectly, but I'm sure that you could write up some sort of excuse as to how they might fit into Chaos Demons in 40k if you really wanted to, even if the lore had to be a bit different. I guess perhaps some of the motivation might be to keep 40k rules bloat down though. I'm sure that when Games Workshop redid all the rules for 8th edition, they realised just how much of a crazy back catalogue they had of wild and wonderful things from Forge World or past army lists that had lots of rules for miniatures they'd never made models for. And it does feel like the drive has generally been to rationalise the 40k range, only make rules for things that are in the 40k range, and then sort of peripherally support things with Legends a bit more. It might just be that the aim is not to cram rules in for literally every character that they release, or if they do so, make them Legends rules where they can just do a one and done, write the rules and give them a points cost, and then basically forget they existed after that. I've talked about lots of things where the drive was to separate things, but there are a few counter-examples as well. Probably the main ones that come to mind are Be'lakor and the Chaos Demon Prince. I guess they're kind of notable as being big bads for Chaos, which is pretty much equally represented in fantasy as it is in the Grimdark setting. But it is kind of fun that they even built the different era compatibility into both models as well, with things like the option for the Slain Space Marine on Be'lakor's base, and the Demon Prince, which has the option for some more 40k Chaos Space Marine style parts, or mainly going for a slightly more fantasy armor, great big armored demon sort of thing. I guess maybe they feel a little bit different, given that the idea is that Chaos is sort of a fairly unified thing between the two settings, even if even in its own way that seems to be diverging a bit, things like Slanesh being a bit different as we mentioned, and the Great Horned Rat in Sigmar, versus I guess the rise of Vashtor as a Chaos demigod in 40k. In any case, I just wanted to mention that as one trend that I found interesting. I feel like there are perhaps some downsides as well as positives to just literally making rules for every single thing that you might expect could translate over in one way or another. But I feel like at least with modern Games Workshop there might be a few more things that they probably could have been a bit more generous or creative about. Maybe things like the Heresy Automata or the Chaos Fury type things from Warcry. They could have worked pretty happily with 40k rules if they'd wanted to. The big drive to separate things as much as possible, though, must be making at least some collectors nervous, particularly for Knights and Custodes, where I feel like these guys are kind of in an awkward position at the moment, just due to what Games Workshop has done with everything else. At the start of 10th edition, they basically said that they were phasing out pretty much most of Forge World for the vast majority of armies in 40k. And then we've seen that with each and every codex that comes out, the only Forge World kits that survive going to Legends and their kits being retired are the really big Titan class stuff. They specifically said that Knights and Custodes would be exempt from that, but I feel like that guarantee is only really going to last up to the point where 10th edition runs out. It's just maybe a bit unnerving if you're collecting Corsa Rastus Knights or the Custodes Forge World units, which are kind of necessary to make them into a more well-rounded army if you want to go big on them. That come a new edition, Games Workshop could just make like the Space Marines and Chaos and basically say that all of the quote-unquote Heresy Era stuff basically just goes to Warhammer Legends and they're not going to bother supporting it anymore after that. I just really hope that for Knights and Custodes they might consider putting these units into the core codex if they really do want to have them hang around into the far future. I guess we already know that they haven't with Custodes in 10th edition, and it seems unlikely that they would with Knights if they didn't with the 1, but failing that, maybe at least some sort of stated guarantee that they are indeed good for their factions for the long term would be really great, even if it's not something that Games Workshop typically does. They probably did have the most drive to actually keep them in the mainline 40k game compared with most stuff though. These Erastus Knights don't really have anything particularly Heresy Era about them, and are pretty much the same sort of styling and patterns as the 40k Questoris, just with a little bit of Heresy Era optional aesthetic bits. And the Custodes aren't exactly known for radically redesigning their technology. Being an impressive Golden Legion with technological marvels at their commands, they don't really need to refine things too much, and just seem like the sort of force that would be pretty constant from the Heresy Era to 40k. In any case though, I'd certainly be interested to get your guys' takes on this. Do you think that Games Workshop could embrace a bit more cross-compatibility within their ranges, or do you think that it's best that as many units as they have resources for are basically represented by one tailored kit and that kit alone, and try and make as much narrative and visual distinction between their different factions as they can? In any case, let me know what you think. I know that this one was a little bit of a rambly one. Just felt like there were quite a few releases and choices that are made with their release schedule that have played into this general sort of theme over the years. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.